In 2009, you were awarded the American Bar Association's Pro Bono Publico Award. In addition, you've also been honored with Trial Lawyer of the Year, award by the Trial Lawyer for Public Justice Foundation, the Justice Award from the National Association of Radiation Survivors, the Dean K. Phillips Memorial Award for Advocacy by the Vietnam Veterans of America, and last, but of course not least, the Contra Costa County Bar Association's President's Award, among many other awards that are too many to mention. You have been actively involved in pro bono and advocacy work since law school. What inspired you, and what would you tell the next generation of lawyers who might ask, why should I get involved in pro bono work?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I was the kind of person who went to law school thinking I would become a public interest lawyer. I mean, that's why I went. Very tough to get those jobs, especially if you have no experience whatsoever. So like a lot of lawyers, I did the next best thing, which is work for a firm that has a demonstrated commitment to pro bono and diversity and the kinds of things that I feel strongly about my whole life. And it was through my father that I got into the particular veterans area, and I grew to really like the area, not only because I liked the people I met, and the people are really down home, homesy, people, very, very likable people generally. But it also gave me a great breadth of kinds of issues to tackle. I mean, where can you get into poverty law, homelessness, federal constitutional law, statutory interpretation, and complex fact patterns, like the radiation, all these huge unannounced and announced nuclear tests before the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. So there's a lot of science in there, and a lot of my cases have had a lot of science or medicine. They're very challenging, but how to get involved? The truth of the answer is, for almost every lawyer, and I think it's true of this generation more than any, it's hard to find time. The pressures are so great, and what I always said to myself is, look, there's never going to be a good time. If you're a good lawyer, and you're a young lawyer, if you're a good lawyer, you're going to be really busy, particularly if you're at a big firm. You're going to be very, very busy, very much sought after. So, when the NARS case came in, I took that, I did it myself. I mean, I was an associate. I didn't really have anybody working above me. I just decided, look, if you're going to do it, you just got to take the cases, and you've got to make the room. And I never thought about hours the way a lot of people think about hours. I said, if I'm going to take a case, it's not going to be on the back of the law firm completely. I mean, in part it's going to be. But if I have to work longer hours for a few years, I'm going to do it. And that's the price that I'm paying. I mean, for the cause of these people. And that's the way I've always done it. So I've had a few years where I billed more hours than I really wanted to, or my family wanted me to. But that is the price you pay, and in particular in this veterans area, if you don't do it, and I found this out over time, if I don't do it, it often never got done. And the most difficult cases to tackle, like the $10 attorney fee limitation, that was amazing. That started out the NARS case. A veteran can't pay an attorney at the time more than $10 to represent him out of his own pocket. And yet we have all these people that are getting their legal fees paid for by the government. And the veteran, I mean, it struck me as a big issue of veterans' civil rights, and that's the way I framed the issue, and that's the way that the debate later got framed. Why are veterans second-class citizens? I mean, the limitations on their rights were so great. No judicial review at that time. Every VA decision was final. You could not hire a lawyer. And the third prong, I used to call it the iron triangle, whereby government insulated itself from liability to the veterans, the metaphor I always use, the little people don't get the rights. And the third thing was the Ferris Doctrine. The Ferris Doctrine basically is a judicially created exception to liability for torts that the government commits. And it's not in the statute, it's not in the Federal Tort Claims Act. It came out of a 1950 Cold War era decision of the Supreme Court, which basically immunized the government from damages for service people. They can't, even in cases of clear malpractice. There's actually a case before the Supreme Court on that right now. It's going to be argued very soon, but it's been around for a long time. So the result was a total lack of accountability, and no one seemed to ever be able to do anything about it. And so over the last 4 decades, or three and a half decades, the judicial review got passed for the first time. Reversal rate, 60%.
No kidding.
60% plus every year. What does that tell you about all the injustice that had been done before judicial review? The attorney fee limitation has been relaxed to some extent.
They get $20?
Actually, you can't pay an attorney at all in the first phase of the case.
Okay.
And if you lose and you demonstrate, I guess, that you need an attorney, you can hire an attorney to do an appeal or to try to reopen your case based upon new and material evidence. Still not very good. I mean, but that has been upheld. But the big things about these cases are all the veterans. When the veterans would try to sue, they often would be improper, or they would have some solo practitioner or some small person be doing a good deed, trying to help them out, but they didn't have the resources to really fight the government. And so all these cases were just getting thrown out in mass. I mean, if you look across, you just look Veterans Administration or DVA across the federal court docket sheets, the computer system, you just find hundreds of cases where they just get thrown out of court. And they always defend these cases the same way. No jurisdiction, hasn't been a waiver of sovereign immunity, all these arguments that have nothing to do with the merits. And they would just get tossed one after another after another, and they never saw their day in court. Well, that took some heavy thinking. Well, how do you deal with these issues? The government has a lot of things that it can assert. The failure to exhaust administrative remedies. Everything. Every lawyer has heard 1,000 times. But I really reacted badly to having people thrown out of court in mass like that, where no one ever heard the merits of their claims. And so some of these basic things that I learned years ago about due process, the right to be heard at a meaningful time, at a meaningful place, with meaningful procedures. These are important rights, and there's a reason why they're in the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't say everyone except veterans has a right to due process.
Right.
It seemed pretty basic to me, yet it took over 30 years to get Cushman and the PTSD, the recent PTSD case, which went off on constitutional grounds, due process grounds. The very recent case that probably is going to the Supreme Court. These are very basic principles, and I always felt I understood due process pretty well. I mean, just because you grow up, as you grow up, you have experiences in life, and I just saw a lot of things, and procedures sometimes are the substance, because if you don't give people the procedures, they never get over the hurdle to have their case heard on the merits. So there are a lot of veterans out there, even today. The most underrepresented segment in our population is veterans, by far. Almost all of them represent themselves. They don't do a very good job because they're not lawyers, and they lose, and people die. And people, when the mother called me and said her son had hanged himself from the rafters of their garage from Iraq, coming back from Iraq with their rope. I'm sorry, their hose, their garden hose, and he'd been turned away 3 times in the last week by the VA. In severe distress, obviously in severe distress. He had a right to treatment, but there was no procedure. No procedure at the VA for contesting a denial of treatment. They can send you away, and then they say, oh, we're immune. Ferris Doctrine, we're immune. And the thing about my new case, the Chemical and Biological Weapons Testing Program case, Edgewood Arsenal, Fort Detrick, they just basically ran hundreds of thousands of troops through a chemical weapons testing program where they injected people with nerve gas, drugs like LSD, Horrible substances like BZ, you've probably never heard of, but it was weaponized. It's a delirium, it's a, what they call a kind of like a knockout drug. It's an incapacitating agent is what they technically call it. But the right dosage, it will knock you out for 2 weeks. You'll be flat on the floor for 2 weeks, and you'll probably die of thirst.
Wow.
And they weaponized it. It was an incredibly powerful drug. Not only were they injecting it into people into their blood vein, but it turns out through discovering this case, and I don't think anybody knows this, they were injecting it through some private entities, researchers who were helping them at universities, intraspinally.
Oh my gosh.
Into your spine to see how more potent it was in your spine. Now, if anybody's had a spinal tap or they know how painful that can be, number one, and number two, and how dangerous it is to be messing with your spine. And they did all kinds of things. They did mescaline intraspinally, all these different chemicals. Over 450 different toxic substances, including most of the organophosphates, which are the pesticides, nerve gases. I mean, you name it, they got it. Antipsychotic drugs. They would give people nerve gas almost to the brink of death, so they could test antidotes for nerve gas, and so they would bring you back. You would have probably died, but for receiving atropine or some kind of antidote to reverse the process. They were doing this for 25, 30 years, 1943 until the late 70s.
Unwitting volunteers who thought they were going into something completely different.
Yeah, they said, well, free, there's a great program at Edgewood Arsenal, work 4 days a week, no KP duty, work in civilian clothes. And the program is to test new gas masks and other equipment to protect troops in the future. Well, they get there, it wasn't to test gas masks. I mean, there were gas masks there, but it was to, they turned the tables on them. And once you'd signed up, you couldn't get out. You know how the military, all that little subtle, it's not subtle. the control that they exercise over the people. And these were, of course, all enlisted men. And all the men in the atomic bomb tests were in the trenches that you've seen from around ground zero at the Nevada test site. All enlisted men. Not a single officer, of course. They put a non-commissioned officer in charge, and they would go on their maneuvers. And it, again, comes back to the little people. And I actually wrote a poem about the little people at one point.
Can you remember it? Can you recite it?
I can't recite it, but I can send it to you if you want.
Okay.
If you want to read it, I'll send
That
it
would
to you. But I know some of the lines, but it's just a way of looking at the world where I coined my own term to describe it: upper snuffy. Upper snuffy, looking down on the little people, and they don't really matter. And it's like the charge of the Light Brigade. If we lose 1 million troops or 500,000. Who cares, because they're just enlisted men. It's that mentality that permeates too much of our society. But bottom line, when you ask anyone, I've talked about my cases with an innumerable number of people over the years. I have not found anyone that thinks I'm wrong or that the veterans are wrong. It's just a huge disconnect between the government and the people.